Well, hello, and come along as we visit our 17th president, Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was born December 29th, 1808, in Raleigh, North Carolina, and passed away July 31st, 1875, near Carter Station, Tennessee. Was the 17th president of the United States from 1865 to 1869, who took office upon the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln during the closing months of the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865. His lenient Reconstruction policies toward the South embittered the radical Republicans in Congress and led to his pitiful downfall and his impeachment, though he was acquitted. Johnson was the younger of two sons of Jacob and Mary McDonnell Johnson. Jacob Johnson, who served as a porter in a local inn, was a sexton in the Presbyterian Church, and as a town constable, died when Andrew was 3 years old, leaving his family in poverty. His widow took in work as a spinner and weaver to support her family, and later remarried. She bound Andrew as an apprentice tailor when he was 14. In 1826, when he had just turned 17, having broken his indenture, he and his family moved to Greenville, Tennessee. Johnson opened his own tailor shop, which bore the simple sign A. Johnson Tailor. When Johnson was president, he remarked that he still knew how to sew a coat. He hired a man to read to him while he worked with needle and thread. From a book containing some of the world's great orations, he began to learn history. Another subject he studied was the Constitution of the United States, which he was soon able to recite from memory in large print. Harry Truman said that Johnson knew the Constitution better than any other president, and many of his later political battles were framed in terms of the constitutionality of proposed legislation. His copy of the Constitution was buried with him. Johnson never went to school and taught himself how to read and spell. In 1827, now 18 years old, he married 16-year-old Elsa McCarter, whose father was a shoemaker. She taught her husband to read and write more fluently and to do arithmetic, also known as math. She too often read to him as he worked. In middle age, she contracted what was called slow consumption, also known as tuberculosis, and became an invalid. She rarely appeared in public during her husband's presidency, the role of hostess usually being filled by their eldest child, Martha, wife of David T. Patterson, U.S. Senator from Tennessee. Jackson's lack of formal schooling and his homespun quality were distant assets in the building of political base of poor people seeking to a fuller voice in government. His tailor shop became a kind of center for political discussion with Johnson as the leader. He had become a skillful orator in an era when public speaking and debate was a powerful political tool. Before he was 21, he organized a working man's party that elected him first as an alderman, then mayor of Greenville. During his 18 years in the state legislature, from 1835 to 1843, he found a natural home in the states' rights Democratic Party of Andrew Jackson and emerged as spokesman for the mountaineers and small farmers against the interests of the landed class. In that role, he was sent to Washington for 10 years as a U.S. representative from 1843 to 1853, after which he served as governor of Tennessee from 1853 to 1857. Elected a U.S. Senator in 1856, he generally adhered to the dominant Democratic views, favoring lower tariffs and opposing anti-slavery agitation. Johnson had achieved a measure of prosperity and owned a few slaves himself. In 1860, however, he broke dramatically with the party when, after Lincoln's election, he vehemently opposed Southern secession. When Tennessee seceded in June of 1861, he alone among the Southern senators remained at his post and refused to join the Confederacy. Sharing the race and class prejudice of many poor white people in his state, he explained his decision. "Damn the Negroes. I am fighting those traitorous aristocrats, their masters." Although denounced throughout the South, he remained loyal to the Union. In recognition of this unwavering support, Lincoln appointed him in May of 1862 military governor of Tennessee, by then under federal control. To broaden the base of the Republican Party to include loyal war Democrats, Johnson was selected to run for vice president for Lincoln's re-election ticket in 1864. His first appearance on the national stage was a fiasco. On Inauguration Day, he imbibed more whiskey than he should have to counter the effect of recent illnesses. And as he swayed on his feet and stumbled over his words, he embarrassed his colleagues in the administration and dismayed onlookers. Northern newspapers were appalled. His detractors later seized on his indecent incident to accuse him of habitual drunkenness. Less than 5 weeks later, he was president. Thrust so unexpectedly into the White House on April 14, 1865, he was faced with the enormously vexing problem of Reconstruction the Union and settling the future of former Confederate states. Congressional radical Republicans who favored severe measures towards the defeat yet largely impotent South were disappointed with the new president's program. With its lenient policy began by Lincoln and its remissive of seceded states into the Union with few provisions for reformer or civil rights for freedom, who, although impacted, were destitute, uneducated, and subject to exploration and mistreatment. This element in Congress was outraged at the return of power to traditional white aristocrat hands and protested the emergence of restrictive black codes aimed at controlling and supporting the former slaves. The Republican majority refused to seat the Southern congressmen and set up a joint committee of 15 on Reconstruction. Johnson viewed their action as usurpation of his power. He believed that continued punitive measures in the South, along with the guarantee of suffrage to blacks, was not supported by the majority opinion nationwide. He was reluctant to insist on suffrage for blacks in the South when it had not been granted in the North. He believed that placing power over whites in the hands of former slaves would create an intolerable situation. Johnson's vetoing of two important pieces of legislation aimed at protecting blacks and an extension of the Freedmen's Bureau Bill and the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was disastrous. His veto united moderate and radical Republicans in outrage and further popularized the situation already filled with acrimony. Congress at first failed to override the Freedmen's Bureau veto. A second attempt carried the measure, but succeeded with the Civil Rights Act. It was the first instance of a presidential veto being overridden. In addition, Congress passed the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, conferring citizenship on all persons born or nationalized in the United States and guaranteeing them equal protection under the law. Against Johnson's objections, the amendment was ratified. In the congressional election of 1866, Johnson undertook an 18-day speaking tour into the Midwest, which he called a swing around the circle. In order to explain and defend his policies and defeat congressional candidates opposing them. His effort proved a failure. His speeches were often rabble-rousing and ill-tempered, as he tried to deal with hecklers, sympathetic with the radicals. In Indianapolis, Indiana, a confrontation with a crowd led to violence in which one man was killed. The result was sweeping electoral victories everywhere for the radicals. With strong majorities in the House and Senate, they would now have sufficient votes to override any presidential veto of their bills. The president was unable to block legislature that tipped the balance of the power to the Congress over the executive. In March of 1867, the new Congress passed, over Johnson's veto, the first of the Reconstruction Act, providing for suffrage, for male freedom, and military administration of the southern states. With Reconstruction virtually taken out of his hand, the president, by exercising his veto and by narrowly intercepting the law, managed to delay the program so seriously that he contributed materially to its failure. He maintained that the Reconstruction Acts were unconstitutional because they were passed without Southern representation in Congress. Aloof, gruff, and undiplomatic, Johnson considered antagonized the radicals. They became his sworn enemies. Johnson played into the hands of his enemies by an imbroglio over the Tenure of Office Act, passed the same day as the Reconstruction Acts. It forbid the chief executive from removing without the Senate's concurrence certain federal officers whose appointment had originally been made by and with the advance and consent of the Senate. The question of the power of the president in this matter had long been a controversial one. Johnson plunged ahead and dismissed from office Secretary of War Edwin M. Station, the radicals' ally within his cabinet, to provide a court test of the acts constitutionally. In response, the House of Representatives voted articles of impeachment against the president, the first such to occur in U.S. history. While the focus was on Johnson's removal of Station in defense of disgrace of the Tenure of Office Act, the president was also accused of bringing into disgrace, ridiculous hatred, contempt, and reproach to the Congress of the United States. The evidence cited was chiefly culled from the speech he had made during his swing around the circle. What was at stake in the trial was not only the fate of the president, but the very nature of the federal government. If Congress were able to remove the president, then many Americans believed the United States would be a dictatorship run by the leaders of Congress. In a theatrical proceeding before the Senate, presided over by Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase, the charges proved weak, despite the passion with which they were argued and the key votes, May 16th and 26th of 1868, fell one short of the necessary 2/3 for conviction. 7 Republicans voted with Johnson's supporters. These men had been placed under the keenest pressure to vote to convict. One of them, Edmund Ross of Kansas, declared that as he cast his ballot, "I almost literally look into my open grave." When a messenger brought Johnson the news that the Senate failed to convict him, he wept, declaring that he would devote the remainder of his life to restoring his reputation. Despite his exoneration, Johnson's usefulness as the national leader was over. During his remaining days in office, he extended his grants of amnesty to all of the former rebels. The vexing problem of black suffrage was addressed by Congress's pass of the 15th Amendment, ratified during the ensuing administration of Ulysses S. Grant, which forbade denial of suffrage on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. At the 1868 Democrat National Convention, Johnson received a modest number of votes, but he did not actively seek renomination. After returning to Tennessee, Johnson finally won re-election in 1875 as a U.S. Senator shortly before he died. He had unsuccessfully run for a Senate seat in 1869 and in 1872 lost the race for a seat in the House of Representatives. Ironically, none of the senators who voted to acquit him was returning to office. In 1926, in the case of Myers v. United States, the Supreme Court handed down an opinion on the tangled question of the president's power to remove officials from office that, in effect, vindicated the position Johnson had taken, declaring the Tenure of Office Act unconstitutional. And with that, I will see you guys in the next one.